Hi, I did my project on the Nile in Egypt. A brief overview on the importance and stability of the Nile River Valley. The image on the right shows the extensiveness of the Nile and the journey it takes from after coming into the Mediterranean Sea and going through northern Africa. And currently now it goes through 10 and 11 different countries, is the support system of the Nile. First, we start off with ancient civilizations, which glorified the river as a way of life, and they found out the way that its early benefits could be most utilized were through irrigations, which gave them the ability to create permanent settlements, which in the early times was uncommon. Most of the people were hunters and gatherers, but with this source of life and this source of living, they were able to construct canals and dikes and all different sorts of ways to find ways to permanently settle in an area with vegetation, food, housing, important stuff, especially the freshwater aspect. The pumping methods that they used are still in effect today. There's multiple methods that were developed before Jesus' time, before earliest of the BCs. Flooding was another problem that was beneficiary yet problematic for the Egyptians. Not as problematic as you would think, though, because the Nile was one of the most predictable rivers of all time. It's a very predictable flood season, so they could use these floods to their advantage. But when it wouldn't flood, would be mostly the problems when the droughts would come along. The process of modernization took over, and it was like I said, extreme flooding, but very controllable and predictable. Uh, Come the 10th century, there was an extreme famine from lack of water from the Nile. There was contamination. The food, the source, and the fresh water source of the Nile was contaminated, which compromised the whole reason why the Nile is there, essentially, other than transportation. Um, that kind of gave the people who lived along the Nile the first wake up call necessarily. But the location of the river makes it the most beneficiary of mostly all rivers throughout the whole entire world. Being located right underneath the Mediterranean Sea and being able to run through right next to the Indian Sea where it lets out in the Suez Canal is probably the best spot where you would see it fitting. And that probably explains why the Nile River is the only river to never be used up and completely depleted throughout all of time. The Nile River distribution, like we said, it's a natural resource, and the hierarchy of who got to use it historically was just Egypt. They took as much as they wanted, didn't really worry about anybody else who was behind them. As you come into times through modernization, you get people who are unhappy with it. Mostly in this case, it was Sudan. And their problem was about fair use of the water, which came across the part of the Nile's Water Agreement in 1929, which was only between Egypt and Sudan, and it resulted in Egypt taking 80% of the water and Sudan taking 20% of the water. Which on the side of the right, on the image to the right, you see that those are not the only countries that are affected by the Nile, nor does it sound fair for them to be left out. Onward with that though, Egypt is on top and remained on top. Through its time of history and through its high rise, it remains on top. Egypt is the king of the Nile. It remains the king of the Nile to this day. There's a reason why. It's its icon. It's its image. When you think Egypt, you think Egyptians in the Nile. And in 1952, the free officers and the high officers at the time proposed the idea of a high dam. And in 1959, before they could actually start completing or start construction of the Aswan Dam, they had to go through another waters agreement because in 1929 is when they realized that the water agreement was no longer valid. They needed to rediscuss new terms. Again, it was only Sudan and Egypt that took part in this deal, resulting in 70% of Egypt gaining the water, 30% of Sudan gaining the water, and originally it was going to submerge an enormous amount of Sudanese land in over 180 meters of water above sea level. So it was going to make part of Sudan's land almost incapacitated by water. There would be no chance of anything. No permanent settlements would be there, And in order for the agreement to go through, Egypt had to reduce the amount of water that was going to be allocated to the Sudanese area. And when they reconsidered the deal, this is when the agreement was settled upon. Egypt and Sudan both claimed that they invited all other countries to the table, but none responded. So they dealed a bit as found as they thought they could. The new age of the Nile. Not a lot has changed. It still provides to be that genuine beneficiary source of life that everybody is dependent on. I mean, 97, 98% of the population of Egypt lives on the Nile Delta. And that's just one country that's dependent on it. That's not the other 9 to 10 countries that live in North Africa, which they get almost no rain throughout the year. And the only time the Aswan Dam, not, I shouldn't say the only time, but the Aswan Dam has proven its worth. And when there were dangerous floods in the 1970s, it was able to stabilize and control the flows. That way the riverbanks weren't destroyed, because with the construction of the Aswan Dam, you construct a lot of wealthy and economic strong points along the side of the bank, and you got to make sure you keep those intact. You got to provide their safety. So the Aswan Dam was able to do that, and the severe droughts in the mid 1880s provided them with a backup source of water that they've never had. They've always been able to hold the water, but to have a separate reserve tank for 2 miles where they could just store water was probably the best thing for Egypt to date. And by making the Aswan Dam, they clear up all this land, the available land right next to the river, instead of going wild. Instead of Now they have construction and format. This available land can now turn into agriculture. It can now be utilized instead of just being marshland that's off the side of the river. This is now land that could be beneficiary, could be prosperous for them. Ongoing, like I said before, the Nile is the only water source to never fail a civilization. And after providing for over thousands of years, it proves to be the only water source that is ongoing. It supplies as it needs to, it's predictable, it's consistently flowing, and to date, the Egyptians and the other countries that are involved with it have not completely depleted the source, which is good to know. And I think that genuinely sums up my report. Thank you. I hope you had a great day.